There are moments on an ordinary morning when the world simply stops, not because of an accident, not because of construction, but because something wild and unexplainable steps into the middle of everything we think we understand. This was one of those mornings, and the people who were there still can't fully explain what they felt when they realized what was actually happening. All 9 was moving the way it always did on a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of steady, unremarkable flow that becomes invisible after years of the same commute. Coffee cups balanced on dashboards, radio hosts filling silence, the pale gold light of early autumn cutting sideways through the tree line. Trucks hauled freight toward the interstate, minivans carried kids to school. A postal worker merged carefully from the shoulder, waving a hand out the window the way people used to do. It was the kind of road where nothing surprising ever happened. That changed at approximately 7:42 in the morning. A woman named Carol, driving her usual route to work at a medical supply office, was the first to see them. She later described the moment the way you describe something that doesn't fit inside normal language, like your brain takes a photograph before it knows what it's looking at. She slowed, then she stopped completely, because standing directly in the center lane, in the middle of a highway carrying 60 miles per hour of morning traffic, were 3 bobcats. Not at the shoulder, not creeping along the guardrail the way deer sometimes do, uncertain and skittish. These animals were in the road, in the lane, standing as though they had chosen to be there. Carol put her hazard lights on. The car behind her did the same, then the one behind that. Within seconds, a chain of brake lights stretched back nearly a quarter mile, and drivers who couldn't yet see the cause began calling out their windows and checking their phones for accident alerts that hadn't been posted yet, because what was happening up ahead wasn't in any database. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a stall. It was 3 wild animals standing on asphalt like they had somewhere to be and weren't leaving until they got there. The bobcats were adults, or close to it, lean and low to the ground, with that distinctive short tail and the tufted ears that give the species an expression caught somewhere between calm and warning. In photographs, bobcats look almost decorative, like something a nature magazine would frame beautifully. In real life, in the middle of a highway, with their eyes tracking the stopped vehicles in front of them, they looked like something else entirely. They looked deliberate. What struck nearly every driver who later gave an account wasn't the fear, though there was some of that, but the confusion, because the animals weren't panicking. They weren't cornered. They weren't darting back and forth in that frantic way wildlife behaves when it's been accidentally pushed into the wrong space. They stood close together, occasionally glancing toward the tree line on the eastern side of the road, then back toward the stopped cars. One of them, the largest, presumably the most dominant, stepped forward slightly as Carol's car idled 30 feet away. Not aggressively, not with any sound or display, just closer. Carol described the feeling as being spoken to in a language she didn't have the words for. Behind her, a man in a contractor's truck had gotten out of his cab and was standing on his running board, trying to see what the holdup was. When he finally spotted the animals, he sat back down and called 911 without a word to anyone. A few cars back, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret had her window down and was watching through reading glasses she'd forgotten to take off. She said later that she didn't feel afraid at any point. She felt, she said, like something important was trying to happen and the rest of the world hadn't caught up to it yet. The 911 calls were brief and confused. There are bobcats in the road, 3 of them just standing there. No, they're not hurt, they're just standing. The dispatchers did their best. A wildlife removal call was logged. A patrol car was already nearby. The traffic jam was real and growing. At its peak, cars were backed up nearly half a mile in both directions. Nobody honked. That detail was noted by almost everyone who talked about it afterward. On a normal morning, 30 seconds of unexplained delay on Route 9 would produce a chorus of horns. That morning, with 3 wild animals standing in the October light not 50 feet from the nearest bumper, everyone was quiet, even the truck drivers, even the people running late. There was something in the way the bobcats held themselves, unhurried, present, almost patient, that asked something of the people watching them. It asked them to wait. It asked them to pay attention. None of the drivers knew yet what they were waiting for. None of them understood what the animals were trying to say. But the bobcats weren't going anywhere. Officer Daniel Reyes had responded to wildlife calls before: a black bear near an elementary school, a coyote circling a parking lot. Each time the protocol was the same:
Approach slowly, give the animal an exit route, let instinct do the rest. Animals, in his experience, always chose escape when escape was available. That was the rule. He pulled onto the shoulder with his lights on, stepped out of the cruiser, and immediately understood why nobody had driven through.
The three Bobcats were still in the road. He stood at the front of his vehicle and watched them for a long moment. The way you watch something when you're trying to decide if what you're seeing is actually what you're seeing. They were aware of him. There was no question about that. Their heads had turned the moment his door opened, but they didn't scatter. They didn't crouch into a defensive posture. The largest one held his gaze with an expression that Reyes would later struggle to describe in his report. He took one step forward. The bobcat didn't retreat. Instead, it turned its head, slowly, almost deliberately, toward the tree line on the eastern shoulder, then back to him, then toward the trees again. Reyes stopped walking. He'd heard stories. Everyone who spends enough time outdoors has heard some version of the story. The dog that led someone to a collapsed hiker. The horse that refused to cross a bridge that later gave way. He'd always filed those stories under the category of things people wanted to believe. He was a practical man. He believed in what he could document. But the bobcat looked at the trees again, and this time all three of them did. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't random. It was the same motion, repeated, patient, the way you gesture toward a door when someone doesn't understand you the first time. Come here, over here, look. Reyes keyed his radio and told dispatch he was going to check the wood line. He moved carefully off the shoulder and toward the brush, watching his footing, watching the animals. As he closed the distance, something shifted. The tension in their bodies, that low, coiled stillness, began to ease, and then, one by one, the bobcats stepped off the asphalt and moved into the tree line ahead of him. They weren't running, they were leading. Reyes followed. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves. The kind of quiet that only exists just beyond the edge of a highway, where the road noise fades into something distant and the world narrows down to what's directly in front of you. Reyes moved carefully, one hand brushing aside a low branch, his eyes tracking the three bobcats as they moved through the brush ahead of him. They weren't fast, they kept looking back. He had gone maybe 40 feet from the shoulder when they stopped. They gathered near a dense patch of tall grass and scrub brush at the base of an old oak. Close together, heads lowered, that restless glancing energy suddenly replaced by something quieter. Something that looked, if he was being honest with himself, like relief. Reyes approached slowly, crouched down, and there, pressed into the flattened grass, barely visible beneath a tangle of dried brush, was a bobcat kitten. It was small, shockingly small, with the oversized paws and spotted coat of an animal only weeks into its life. It was alive. He could see the shallow rise and fall of its breathing, but it wasn't moving. One of its back legs was extended at an angle that wasn't right, and there was a stillness to the way it lay that told him it hadn't moved in some time. It looked at him with wide, glassy eyes and made no sound at all. Reyes sat back on his heels and didn't move for a moment. He thought about the highway, about three wild animals standing in the center of a lane during rush hour, holding their ground against 2,000-pound vehicles, refusing every instinct that should have sent them deep into the woods the moment the first car slowed. He thought about the way the largest one had turned its head toward the trees, again and again, with a patience that had no explanation in any wildlife manual he'd ever read. They hadn't been lost, they hadn't been confused or cornered or acting out of fear. They had been waiting for someone to follow. He radioed for wildlife rescue without taking his eyes off the kitten. Behind him, through the trees, he could still hear the distant idle of stopped engines. The adults had settled a few feet away, watching him without tension now, their bodies low and still. He stayed where he was, crouched in the leaves, keeping his presence calm and steady, until he heard sirens approaching from the south. He didn't want the kitten to be alone. The wildlife rescue team arrived within 20 minutes. Two technicians moved through the brush with a soft carrier and gloved hands, speaking in the low, unhurried tones professionals use when they need an animal to understand it is not in danger. The kitten offered no resistance. It was carefully lifted, checked, and wrapped in a thin fleece blanket before being secured in the carrier. The whole process took less than 4 minutes. The adults watched from a short distance. They didn't interfere. They didn't retreat. They simply watched, the way you watch something you've been carrying for a long time finally pass into someone else's hands. Then, quietly, they disappeared into the trees. No dramatics, no lingering. They were there, and then they were gone, absorbed back into the forest as completely as if the last 2 hours had been a dream. Reyes stood at the woodline for a moment after they left, looking at the place where they had been. Then he walked back to the road. Traffic began moving within minutes. Drivers who had waited in patient, bewildered silence slowly pressed their accelerators and resumed the morning that had been briefly interrupted. Most of them would spend the rest of the day trying to explain what they had seen to people who hadn't been there. Most of those conversations would trail off in the same place, at the part where 3 wild animals stood in the middle of a highway and refused to move until someone paid attention. Some things don't fit neatly into the language of ordinary days. The kitten, a female, was admitted to a regional wildlife rehabilitation center that afternoon. She had a fractured rear leg, likely from a fall, and mild dehydration. The veterinary team stabilized her, set the fracture, and began the slow work of helping her heal. She was given a temporary name by the staff, something warm and simple, the kind of name people give when they know an animal is only passing through on its way back to where it belongs. She was a fighter. Within 2 weeks, she was eating on her own. Within 6, she was moving through her enclosure with the loose, fluid confidence of an animal remembering what its body was built to do. On a cool morning in early December, she was returned to the forest, released near the same stretch of tree line where she had been found, in the territory where she was born. She paused at the edge of the brush for just a moment. Then she was gone. Back on Route 9, the highway moved the way it always did. Steady, unremarkable, invisible. But some of the people who drive that road still slow down a little when they reach